People want to believe. The need to believe that something else is out there is powerful. This is one of those things that allows them to express that belief. Ouija expert Robert Murch quoted in Smithsonian Magazine. Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. It's just me today because Jen is feeling a little under the weather, but we're back talking about Ouija. This time we are talking about the period from 1891 to 1914 and kind of this pre-Ouija Mania when people just started getting into the Ouija board, but it wasn't the full-fledged Ouija Mania that started after World War I. So I'm excited to talk about it. But first, I learned a couple things that I wanted to update you guys on about the invention of the Ouija board, because this week I happened to do a newspaper search of the term witch board, because I realized I hadn't actually searched for that specific term yet, and I uncovered a pretty interesting and fun story that I wanted to share. So on June 2nd, 1886, President Grover Cleveland got married. He was the first president to marry while in office, and his new bride was the youngest first lady ever at 21 years old. Just a side note, both of them seem like they were pretty bad people. Cleveland had some sexual assaults to his name, which is not so surprising since he married someone so much younger than him. And later on, during the 19-teens, his wife, Frances Cleveland, was pro-war, anti-immigrant, and anti-women's suffrage. She once said that, quote, "Women aren't intelligent enough to vote." So they sound like a really charming couple. When they got married, one of their wedding gifts was a witch board sent by the Reed Toy Company, who was the company who manufactured the Espiritu board that we talked about last week. That was one of the boards that William Folt's company ended up suing and then taking over the trademark for. This is interesting to me because the Reed Toy Company actually created something like a Ouija board in 1886, which was 5 years before William Folt's company even existed. So, they probably didn't patent it, and so that's probably what the problem was there. But I thought it was interesting that there's actual, written proof in the newspaper record saying that they at least manufactured some kind of talking board first. And they literally gave it to the president. I hadn't seen that info anywhere else, so I wanted to share it. And I also wanted to read a little bit from the Boston Globe article about the gift because I found it very funny and weird. So to read a little bit. Should the president desire to settle any problematical questions, he can do so by calling upon his witch board for aid from the spirits. Should any of the giddy boys in the cabinet endeavor to flirt with the nation's bride, it could not be done with impunity, as the telltale board would waft back the intelligence from the land beyond the portals to an unsuspecting public. No well-regulated family will now lack one of the articles which can glean information from a realm which even the telephone monopoly can't reach. The following letter accompanied the piece of spiritualized lumber. To the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. Honored Sir, we take the liberty to send you by express today an article of our own manufacture, which is attracting a great deal of attention, called the witch board. When two persons of proper magnetism sit opposite each other and place one finger of each hand on the edge of the small table, it will move around and answer questions asked by spelling out the word. The witch board discloses the past and foretells the future. Trusting that it may be of service to, I am very respectfully yours, Charles E. Dresser, Treasurer. There were a number of follow-up articles that showed Cleveland's responses, and I wanted to read that too because I thought it was fun. Dear Sir, I acknowledge with thanks the receipt of the witch board. I shall admire it, but I shall not at present test its power of disclosing the past or foretelling the future. Yours very truly, Grover Cleveland. So a couple interesting things there, aside from this being proof that the Reed Toy Company was creating a talking board before the Kennard Novelty Company, but also it comes back to this idea of magnetism. There's two people with a specific magnetism, and that's what makes the board work. I also like that the president received the board and felt like he had to make a public statement I guess because of all the articles saying that the board was sent to him, and that he had to be like, no, I won't be using it. Thanks a lot, but no thanks. And then also, I was reading a book called Occult America by Mitch Horowitz, and it gave a few details about some of the stuff we talked about last week that I hadn't seen written elsewhere, so I wanted to cover a little bit of that. So, apparently there was at least one version of the Ouija board's box, like the packaging, that said, it draws the two people using it into close companionship and weaves around them a feeling of mysterious isolation, which really emphasizes what we were talking about it being an excuse to be intimate with someone. And I hadn't realized that the packaging had been that explicit about it, but it makes a lot of sense and I think is a very clever marketing tack. And then the book also had a little bit more info about William Fuld. Apparently he started working at the Kennard Novelty Company when he was a teenager, and he worked as a varnisher and did operational work there. And then it said that Kennard was removed from the company because of a financial dispute, which I guess makes sense, and you could kind of guess that from what happened, but I hadn't seen it kind of written out so clearly elsewhere. So let's talk Ouija Mania, or really what I'm calling pre-Ouija Mania, which is the period from 1891, when the Ouija board was first officially manufactured, through 1914, when the First World War began. Ouija Mania really started in earnest during World War I, so we'll stop there. There's a lot more to say about that. And I mentioned last week that we were going to talk about Egyptomania this week, because the Victorian fascination with Egypt, I think, really ties in closely with their fascination with the Ouija board. You know, the Ouija board was even called the Egyptian luck board, and was marketed in a way that made it seem as exotic and potentially Egyptian as possible. But somewhat predictably, I found so much good information about Egyptomania, and it's too fun of a topic to kind of squeeze in with this pre-Ouija Mania. I wanted to give it a little bit more room to breathe, and I wanted us to have a chance to really dig in. So the earliest case of someone getting extremely obsessed with Ouija that I know of was reported in a Boston Daily Globe article called Crazed Through Ouija. Neglected by her lover, she seeks comfort of a fortune-telling device. So this is from November 21st, 1891, the year the Ouija board started to be sold. So 28-year-old Eugenie Carpenter, who was called a fine-looking woman, was found wandering around in public nearly naked. The people who encountered her couldn't reason with her, and she kept saying, "Ouija said so, and I knew it was true." So it turns out that her husband had left her, and for the past year she'd had a new boyfriend. They'd argued about some small thing and split up. So then when she heard that the Ouija board had magic powers, she got one and asked it if her husband would return. The board said no. Then she asked if her boyfriend would return, and the board said, "He has ceased to love you. He will never return." So apparently she grew pale when she got that message, but she soon regained her composure and seemed fine, until a few days later, when her neighbor found her staggering around nearly naked, saying, "Ouija said so, and I knew it was so." In another article about this, published in the Buffalo Evening News on the same day, they described her as a young divorced woman, and it ends with the wonderful line, "Catholic clergymen are waging a war upon Ouija boards as dangerous to the young." So that first year that the board was manufactured, the Catholic Church already had an issue with it and already was saying that it was dangerous. Another story, I found kind of a fun little article in the Indianapolis Journal from December 6, 1891, where there's a short column in the society section that talks about ladies who consult Ouija boards. And it was basically like, this is the worst thing ever. They schedule or cancel parties based on what the board says. And it cast it as this foolish and bad thing. And, these silly women are making decisions based on a Ouija board about parties. And someone could argue that maybe parties aren't that important, and whether or not they reschedule parties aren't that important. But I guess it's important to a society column writer, and I guess they had some bad things to say about these ladies. Of course, so many of these stories are gendered, and kind of casting women as fools, and this kind of comes up again and again, and that's totally unsurprising, right? So in April 1892, the society pages in the Memphis Appeal Avalanche reported, The society folks of Little Rock are infatuated with the Ouija board. It must be so when the leading minister in the city preaches against it. When he uttered the words, there was a general shifting of positions in the pews and briefly whispered conversations which clearly showed the majority of the congregation was personally affected by the remarks. So I guess some church members insisted that the sermon wasn't directed at them. They said it was directed at a formerly Christian family that had recently gotten into spiritualism, and they'd been trying to communicate with their dead son. But the author of the article said that was not the case, and that it was directed at these specific people in the congregation. So then the article describes how Ouija became popular among society people, which is kind of an interesting story. There was a well-connected woman who worked in the fire insurance business, which I'm sure was very lucrative in the 19th century when it seems like every building was always burning down. She got into Ouija when her business partner was run over by a fire department truck and killed just a few weeks before this article was written. She tried to communicate with her business partner through the board, and the board told her about some business he'd been working on the day he died. There was a policy where the premium had not been paid yet, and the spirit through the board told her exactly where the papers were, etc. So then she located those papers and told everybody about it, and said that she couldn't have gotten that info any other way. Which, that seems like such a waste of talking to the dead, right? Like, they're like, oh, there's some paperwork I didn't finish. Please finish this paperwork. I have nothing to say about the afterlife. Or anything. I'm just here for the paperwork. Very weird. So then the article then goes through and calls out people, like society people, by name. And it's a pretty funny list of people and what they're using the board for, and it's just like insulting them. But my favorite line is this. Frank Powley has become a victim of the craze and spends 2 hours every day and the entire afternoon and evening on Sundays consulting friendly spooks. Nearly all the spirits with whom he holds communion are in hell. It's just like some fun 19th century newspaper writing that doesn't even make sense, like friendly spooks in hell, whatever. But already, from the beginning of when this board existed, we're getting people talking about how there are spirits from hell talking through them, talking about how it's bad for young people to play with them, and like the church, both the Catholic Church, and I assume this is a Protestant church, are speaking out against it. And these articles are in chronological order. So I found an interesting article in the National Tribune in Washington, D.C. from July 28th, 1892. It's kind of bemoaning how the Ouija board has become more than just a toy. So to read a bit of it, the Ouija was simply meant to be a toy and was gotten out for the last Christmas holidays. It was a surprise that it took as well as it did and that the demand for them kept up so long. However, it finally did seem to die out. But then the spiritualists discovered that it was just what was needed for the spiritual communications, and that it is better for them than the planchette, as the opportunities for fraud are less with the Ouija. The article goes on to describe what a Ouija board looks like, and then says, "This is the toy that amuses the young folks and serves to express the thoughts of the friends of the spiritualists." A couple interesting things there. I think it's odd that they're saying it's less fraudulent than the planchette, because having played a little bit with the planchette that I have, I feel like it would be harder to fake something there, because you have to somehow like write something out in longhand versus just moving a piece on a board. But I'm sure the spiritualists preferred it because it was much easier, and probably easier to get answers that made some kind of sense. So there's an interesting story in an article from The Sun in New York from September 14th, 1892. It tells the tale of a party in England where the partygoers were playing with the Ouija board, and one of the attendees was a skeptic, and someone suggested that the skeptic ask a question mentally and then see if the board answered. The skeptic did, and the board answered a French joke. The skeptic said that was no answer, but somebody asked the board to explain, and the board replied, "What is joke in French?" So then they looked up the word for joke in French, which is plaisanterie. I took French in high school, but I probably still pronounced that badly. But anyway, at that, the skeptic leapt up in surprise, saying, "I asked this question in my mind, and not a soul in the room could possibly know what it was. The question had been, what horse will win the Cambridgeshire?" Plaisanterie was one of the horses favored to win that race. So later on, Plaisanterie did win the race, And the article said that it's unclear if anyone at the party won any money based on the prediction. So another article kind of talking about the planchette and the Ouija board. This is an article from the Manitoba Daily Free Press. It has a bit of interesting stuff comparing Ouija and planchette and says, the planchette created a great furor, but the exposers of the unscrupulous operators destroyed the popular interest in it. Although spiritualists generally yet give it credence. Some say that there is less chance of fraud with the Ouija than with the planchette, while others maintain the opposite. Those who have faith in it tell marvelous stories of the operations of the Ouija. They say that intricate questions prepared by strangers to the operators, and known only to the former, have been answered correctly and rapidly. The intense excitement that accompanies many of the Ouija demonstrations has resulted seriously in a number of instances. Reports from various parts of the country where the Ouija has been taken up show that a number of believers have had their minds upset by this nervous excitement. A recent dispatch from Liberty, Indiana, said that John Chapman and his wife, a prosperous couple of that town, had gone stark mad because the Ouija demonstrations had overexcited them. So I found this story talking more about this John Chapman character on the Museum of Talking Boards website. So basically these two people, John Chapman and his wife, locked the children in their rooms and destroyed nearly all of the furniture in the house. Cops, John Chapman's wife, who was a minister's daughter, cutting circles in the walls of her room. And I guess John Chapman was doing the same thing with a scythe. Carpets in the home had been slashed into small strips, and knives, hatchets, and other deadly weapons were found lying around. So the wife, who, by the way, her name isn't given in anything that I've seen. That's why I'm just calling her the wife, or John Chapman's wife. The wife said that Horace Greeley, who, if I'm remembering right off the top of my head, was the publisher of the New York Tribune. He ran the New York Tribune. Maybe he was the owner. But she said that Horace Greeley had contacted her during a Ouija session and told her to convert the world to Masonic principles. And the Museum of Talking Boards website says it was unclear how their actions were going to accomplish this. But I think that's a really interesting and weird story, and I feel like it's of a piece with the story about the naked divorced woman going around in the streets. I wonder how much of this is like people grasping on an excuse to kind of do some weird stuff, and like, this isn't the same thing as what we were talking about when we did the episode on ghost hoaxing, where we talked about how in Australia, around this time in the 19th century, Australians, just regular Australians, were dressing up in glow-in-the-dark paint and running through the streets, and some of these people were naked, and the paint was poisonous and also could cause mental health problems. And it was kind of this excuse to behave strangely or behave in a way that wasn't appropriate, at least in society's eyes. And so, of course, like, I don't know why someone would want to destroy their house, but also, like, maybe it's just the excuse that somebody needed to, like, really flip out and kind of have a breakdown. And they're like, oh no, this supernatural thing is in my life now, and I'm gonna freak out about it. I would love to know more about what these people's lives were like. And especially the fact that the wife was the daughter of a minister. That really makes me have some questions and wonder how much of this, like, is any of this a reaction to the Christian setting, like this Victorian Christian setting that they're living in? I don't know, but it's interesting. So I wanted to read a nice thing, something a little less intense than what we just looked at. So just one interesting thing, looking at accounts of Ouija boards during this time, they mostly appear in society columns. And my guess is that would probably be because, like, whose parties are going to get written up? Rich people, society people, right? And I guess maybe common people only get a write-up if something happens, like they cut a bunch of circles in their house, get rid of all their furniture, and say that they want to convert the world to Masonic principles. But this is a nice description of a moonlit picnic from the Marion Times Standard in Marion, Alabama, August 17th, 1894. One of the most enjoyable entertainments it has been our pleasure to attend was the moonlit picnic at the residence of Mrs. West on last Wednesday night. Ice cream and cake were served in the dining room at any hour you wished it, and altogether it was a most pleasant affair. One of the most prominent amusements of the evening was the Ouija board. It afforded much pleasure to young folks, especially your correspondent, answering questions, and most of them correct. It was a late hour when one and all began to seek refuge under the shelter of their own roofs, with the thought lingering in their minds of the evening just past, being one of the most pleasant ever spent in the annals of West Perry. That's just kind of nice. Nice little slice of life. And it's kind of nice in this time of everyone being locked down and isolated to imagine just this like nice 19th century moonlit picnic. So to go to Brooklyn 2 years later, in October of 1896, I found in a newspaper called the Brooklyn Daily Eagle a pretty fun feature called Ouija's Seance. So to read a little bit, the Ouija board is an innocent-looking thing in itself, but the members of a certain Brooklyn family have reason to believe that, like many other innocent-appearing things, it is an instrument of Mephistophelan? You know what I mean. Something like Mephistopheles. Ingenuity and consequence. Of course, the craze for this creaking, three-legged stool with its alphabetical habit has almost died out, yet the particular board in question had only recently been bought before it was burned with appropriate ceremonies. So this article is fun for me, for several reasons. One, because there's several references to Faust in this article, and I know I can't say that word that's relating to Mephistopheles, but it mentions Mephistopheles, it mentions Faust. I find that really fun in like a puff piece about a wealthy family in Brooklyn playing with a Ouija board. And kind of this whole article has this fun sense of kind of overinflated importance. And you can kind of just tell they wanted to sell some papers. But it is a fun article. So this article is about a well-off Brooklyn family who play with a Ouija board for the first time. The board gives them some predictions about the upcoming presidential election, saying that McKinley would win, and then their session is interrupted by the doorbell. They get a servant to get the door, and in the meantime they ask the board who the visitor was. The board spells out W-A-J. So the guest was a Mr. Johnson, and it turns out his initials were W-A-J. Though the family was impressed by the board, Mr. Johnson declared the board was a fraud. And then the Ouija board spelled out, Mr. Johnson is an ass. Then the board said that Mr. Johnson was in love with one of the daughters in the family. There's a great quote here. Now, as a matter of fact, anyone who has ever possessed one of these boards will know as a love maker it is irrepressible. A full moon, a babbling brook, and all the other accessories of a short story writer are simply nothing compared to the Ouija as matchmaker. So the article reports that Mr. Johnson left the house muttering, rot, superstition, full board, etc., which I find very fun. So then the family went back to the board. So the two daughters were at the board. The board said that one of them was sweet but too conceited. Then the board said that the father drank too much, and that the mother, who was watching, but not at the board, got mad and accused the daughters of pushing the planchette. Which seems pretty likely, right? Like, they could probably have guessed who was at the door to visit them. They probably would have found it fun to say, Mr. Johnson is an ass. This is, again, to me, this feels like an excuse to say some things that you wouldn't say otherwise, kind of like what we were talking about. It gives you this shield where you can be like, I didn't say it, the ghost said it. The mother went and put her hands on the planchette, and then the board quickly spelled out, you are a gibbering old woman. It is you who drive your husband to drink. You are. Then, before it could finish the sentence, the table fell over, almost causing a fire when the lamp that was on the table toppled off. But luckily the father caught it just in time. The mother started yelling at the daughter and at the board, and then when she finally sat down, as soon as she put her hand on the planchette, it zoomed to goodbye. And the article claimed that the planchette moved so quickly that the mother's hand was almost dislocated. So they kept trying to use the board, but every time, the planchette just went straight to goodbye. Apparently, they had insulted the board. So they all went to bed, leaving the board out on the parlor table. The daughters snuck out of bed a little before midnight and had what the article called a sentimental seance, where apparently they learned that all of their friends were in love with them and wanted to propose, and it even said that a young man who had disappeared previously had actually killed himself because he couldn't decide which of the two girls he loved more. So then, right at midnight, as they were sitting at the board sped up and things got weird. So then the board said Shakespeare, and then the girls quoted a soliloquy from Hamlet about graveyards yawning and graves doing queer things. The girls asked if the board had anything important to tell them, and the board said yes. Then the board gave a specific date when their mother would die. The girls both fainted, and their father heard the noise, I guess from them falling out of their chairs, and came down angrily. So the next morning they decided they would burn the board. It was clearly evil. As the date that the board had given them approached, the mother fell ill, but she didn't die. So then the girls thought, maybe they'd remember the wrong date. So they bought another Ouija board and tried it again at midnight that night. And it turns out they had gotten the date wrong. They'd been a week off. The board told them, okay, it's actually a week from now when your mother will die. Their mother got sick again, but she still didn't die. And the article ends there, wondering if the prediction that McKinley would win was right. But it notes that the neighbor's board said that he wouldn't win. So for now, it was a draw. And just for the record, McKinley did win. So one of the boards was right. One of the boards was not right. So I found one article that I found really interesting. It's called A Singular Case of Dementia from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat from April 14th, 1898. So this article is subtitled, Miss Bellacy Thomas, a Victim of Christian Science Study. So this is an article about a school teacher named Bellacy Thomas. The tone of this article is pretty different to me from the tone of all the rest of the articles, but I can't quite figure out why. The tone of this article is pretty reasonable. It talks a lot about Bellacy Thomas's family and past. Maybe it's because this woman is a devout Christian scientist and has been studying a lot. Although it kind of sounds like Christian Science at the time was seen as not being a normal Christian and was almost seen in the same light as spiritualism. It could also be that, unlike a lot of these other articles, it's not really about someone doing something really bizarre, and it's not about rich people. Honestly, the biggest reason why I wanted to bring up this article is because it's about a Black woman. Bellacy Thomas was Black, and I feel like I haven't found many articles about anyone aside from presumed white people using the board, usually a kind of silly white woman. And I wonder if there was a racial or class element to people who are into Ouija boards, or if maybe just like Black folks and people of color were just not written up in newspapers for such a innocent thing as a Ouija board. I will say that looking through these newspapers, doing this series on Ouija, I've been probably more surprised than I should have been at how racist a lot of these newspapers are. For me, at least, there's one thing about reading about how racist people were in a certain time period, and then it's really different seeing, a quarter-page ad for Birth of a Nation, which is, the kind of like a groundbreaking silent film about the KKK, basically, and having quotes from educators saying, every Southern child should see this movie, and basically things talking about how it's the Southerners' duty to see this movie and to kind of believe hateful things. I guess I'm, really used to reading more 19th century newspapers from the New York City area, and not that those papers didn't have some racist stuff, but a lot of these newspapers just are just really blunt. It's kind of depressing. So I will say this article is somewhat racist, like any article from this time, pretty much, it seems like. So I just want to read this line. Miss Thomas belongs to the most exclusive set of her race in the city, and was distinguished for her refinement of manner and her interest in physical studies. So, yikes. I do wonder if she would have gotten any kind of write-up, and such a, like, relatively charitable one, you know, racist comments notwithstanding. It's charitable by the standards of the time. If she hadn't been this respectable school teacher who clearly this article's author thought highly of, and it sounds like thought highly of despite her being black. So the article starts out saying, "A singular case of dementia attributed to a too intense study of Christian Science in connection with the revelations of a talking table or Ouija board has just come to light." So it continues talking about how she had started studying Christian Science a few years before and had believed in it very much. She had 2 sisters, one who lived in Chicago and was also a Christian Scientist, and another who lived nearby and also was a teacher. So the year before, their mother had died, and a little after that, her beloved aunt died. And Bella C. Thomas had actually taken care of her aunt during her illness. So after these 2 deaths, she became even more interested in Christian Science, and apparently she bought a Ouija board, quote, to aid her studies. So there isn't an explanation in this article of how a Ouija board would help her learn about Christian Science. But the article does go on to say that she got some really impressive answers from the board, which really made her believe in it. So the article said that she was getting messages from the spirit world, and that she got some bad news. So to read a bit more, one message brought much sadness to her, and that was that she would not live long and must prepare for her entry into the spirit world. Miss Thomas was never very robust at any time, and brooding over the thought of her early demise, given to her by the Ouija board, caused her to become still more delicate, and she spoke of her early death as a certainty. So this is really sad, right? This object that it seems like she has bought, and it seems like she really sees it as, like, connecting her to God, right? Like, if it has to do with her being a practicing Christian Scientist, that's really sad that she has gotten this news that she's going to die, and, you know, she believes it. The Monday before this article was published, Bella C. Thomas taught her classes as usual. She seemed fine. She talked to the principal. They had a good conversation. But she got home and she started feeling really bad. So to read a little bit. A short time after getting home, she was taken with delirium and talked of the Ouija's message in a flighty way, which alarmed her friends. Her sister, who lived nearby, took her to their other sister's place in Chicago for a change of scenery. And the article concludes, "It is not thought her trouble is more than a temporary indisposition, caused by study and overwork, and that a few weeks' rest will restore her to her usual health and spirits." So this article is a lot more thoughtful than a lot of the others about Ouija boards, despite its obvious issues. I also like that it gives you a slice of this woman's life. You get to see her family and her friends supporting her and taking care of her, and she isn't labeled as a hysteric or anything like that. They're basically just saying she's burnt out, she's been working too hard, she needs to recover. As a side note, I tried to figure out a little bit about what Ouija has to do with Christian Science, and I wasn't very successful. I did find an essay called Psychoanalysis, Its Value and Its Dangers that was published by the Episcopal Church in 1922 that says, "Freud is the author of a new gospel, and all psychologists before him but children in the science, and its bitter opponents, who indignantly renounce Freud and all his works, and regards psychoanalysis as a fad to be classed with Christian Science, Ouija board reading, and Spiritism." So it does seem like Christian Science and Ouija and spiritualism were thrown together often. And I also learned that Christian Science, it became a thing around the same time as spiritualism and as the Ouija board. So Christian Science was founded in 1879. For a while, it was actually the fastest growing religion in the US. It grew from 9,000 members in 1890 to 60,000 members in 1906, and then to 260,000 members at its height in the 1930s. But especially around the beginning of Christian Science, its founder was sometimes accused of spiritualism. So there must have been some kind of guidance or suggestion at the time for, people who are serious about Christian Science to do some stuff that's somewhat spiritualist. I don't know a super lot about Christian Science. I do know that there's some controversies about it not partaking in medicine. I remember reading something about how the idea is that you wouldn't get sick if you were holy or something to that effect. So I do kind of see this almost magical element to it, right? Like if your faith can heal you, etc. Or if your illness is a sign of you having some kind of flaw spiritually. But yeah, I just found this article really interesting. I found it really different from anything else I found from this time period. I just wanted to talk about it, particularly because it's about a Black woman, and there's so few stories that really tell you about a person's life and their families, etc. So if you'll remember, one of the articles we were looking at earlier talked about how Ouija has become less and less popular these days. These days being, sounds like the late 1890s. There weren't a lot of interesting articles about this sort of Ouija mania, or people getting really obsessed with Ouija boards in this time period, until about 1914. And still, 1914 is when World War I started. So I just want to leave you with a couple things from 1914. So one tidbit that I enjoyed was that apparently President Woodrow Wilson used the Ouija board, or at least he claimed that he did. Someone asked him in 1914 if he would be reelected, and he said, "The Ouija board says yes." And I think that could have just been a joke. Or maybe he really did use the Ouija board. I just like that there's, this is kind of bookended by two presidents and their mentions of Ouija boards. So then I wanted to read from a customer letter from 1914 that was written to William Fuld. I thought it was really nice and really interesting. So the letter is as follows. "Dear Sir, about a year ago I was given one of your Ouija boards by an old lady who had had it for many years. I became very much interested in it. At first it required 2 persons to get any writing, then I could get it alone. Now for a long time I have let no one touch it but myself. I simply lay it on the table, and with one hand it begins writing at once and very rapidly, just as fast as I can read it. To me it is a marvelous thing, most wonderful. It has gone back over my life as the film of a moving picture would be unrolled, and has explained so many things to me that I did not understand that had happened in my life. It tells me nothing of the future, only that I must be patient, and all will come as I wish. I am writing this to ask if you could tell me any more about it, confidentially, of course. Does Ouija mean Jesus? It seems to me that I went from plane to plane. Each time I seemed to know was a better spirit writing, until now I felt there is a most high one. I've had many friends buy them, but tell them to go to them in love and veneration, as one would go in the presence of something most high and good. They all have found it most wonderful. Please pardon this long letter from a stranger, and allow me to thank you for many hours of great peace and happiness brought to me through this Ouija. Louis W. Ingram. So I just thought that was a nice note to end on. There's so much that's said about Ouija boards being evil or demonic or from hell or from the devil or driving people crazy. I do find this idea interesting that this person has found peace and joy at the Ouija board. While I'm very excited to talk about a lot of dark stories about demonic stuff and Ouija boards. In fact, today my book that I ordered just came in about that 1949 possession that inspired The Exorcism and that involves a Ouija board, and I'm really excited to dig into that book. So, I'm eager to talk about these things, but it's also nice to consider that maybe the Ouija board has been positive for some people. So next time we'll be talking Egyptomania, and then after that we'll go into actual Ouija Mania, which started in earnest during World War I. Also, one kind of funny thing, so I am at my sister's place. I'm not in New York right now, so I'm recording in a closet, so if the sound quality is a little different, that's why. And I'm standing up, whereas usually I'm sitting down. And this whole time, my ankles keep popping as I'm standing, so I've tried to edit out all of the instances of my ankles popping. But if you hear any of that, I feel like it's somewhat thematic, because in the spiritualist movement, a lot of hoaxers used these loud cracking sounds from their toes and their feet to fake these rapping sounds from the spirits. So I just thought that was, I don't even think you can call it a synchronicity, but I found that funny. And also I wanted to mention it in case there are any, spirit wrapping sounds from my ankles popping that I wasn't able to edit out. So thanks for listening. If you liked this podcast, please consider rating or reviewing it on Apple Podcasts or any other podcatcher that you use that lets you rate and review. That will help new listeners find the podcast. The show notes for this episode, which will include all the sources that I used here, can be found at BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. Jen's Instagram is at JenMarieWild. You can email us at BuriedSecretsPodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you with comments, suggestions for things you'd like us to cover. We'd love to hear about any stories you have about Ouija boards in your own life. We'd love to hear about any stories of any weird things in general happening to you. We also have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/buried-secrets. And we'll talk to you next week when we look at Ouijamania in the Victorian era. Thanks for listening.